Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Thank you, Maren, for far too kind words. I've really enjoyed working with you as well on this, and it's a real a joy and a privilege to be here this morning. My paper, I don't have a PowerPoint, which is unusual for me. Another thing that's unusual for me is I'm not presenting findings. Now, I've got a lot of published papers that are, I think, pretty accessible. I try and make them accessible as possible. I am working on some projects at the moment. I could have written on findings, but actually what I'm going to be talking about is something that Maren suggested when I was looking at ideas, and that is how I came to be in the field of Anglo-Indian studies in the first place. I'm certainly always interested to hear how other people came to be in this field. It's a small field. And so that is the main content of my paper today. I'm going to present two stories. The first is how I came to be in the field, and the second is just a short story that brought me up short because of the way that my research was received. Okay, so just to map out what I'm going to be doing this morning. I've come to place great value on stories, particularly life stories, for what they can tell us about a social group's practices and worldviews, and in a really accessible way. Reflections from the field and about entering the field by the researcher can tell us something about the researcher as well as about the researched. And in telling this first story this morning, I also interrupt the narrative now and then to speculate about the meanings I attach to what happened. So I'll tell you the story now of how I came to the research, which led me to be here today. So the question of how a Pākehā New Zealand woman became involved is often asked of me, often in question time about when I've presented findings on something about the community, and then I'm asked by the audience, how did you come to be in this area? Not about the findings. And as an anthropologist, we are required to reflect explicitly on our relationship to the research and to identify prejudices, biases, expectations that we may have, which could impact on the research. The short answer I give to the question, how did you come to be in the field, is that my family had supported Anglo-Indian children from Dr. Graham's homes in Kalimpong for many years, in fact several decades before I became involved. And I became interested in the community through that sponsorship. Now, while that is true, that is the short answer. As Lionel Kaplan and others assert, Anglo-Indians have a culture of gifting and care for members of their community, and this has resulted in my short answer being readily accepted. The fuller answer is that a series of events and coincidences has slowly but surely captivated me with India and one group of its people in particular, to the point that it affects many aspects of my private and personal life, as I describe. Okay, so in December, 28th of December, 1996, that marked my first day ever in India. I had just completed a BA, majoring in anthropology, and I just had a significant birthday. And this holiday to India was in part a celebration of both of those things. I arrived with my family, including 3 young daughters, to this city, Madras as it was then. We'd carefully planned a 6-week trip around the south of India, all organised by letters at that time, mailed and excitedly received in our letterbox at home in New Zealand, for hotels, for transportation, for other events. A couple of days after arriving, it was New Year's Eve. We were still in Madras and had decided to celebrate the New Year on New Zealand time for the sake of our children who had trouble staying up. That was 4:30 local time. In preparation for our hotel room party, we took a taxi to a local supermarket. It was very westernised for the time. I wonder which one it was. Is it Spencer's that's been around for that sort of length of time? Yeah, that name rang a bell. There were two Australian women who were also staying at the hotel we were at, the New Woodlands, and they had told us about it. One of the women had lived in Madras earlier, and I come back to her story a little later. While my girls were looking around the shelves and excitedly finding familiar food, Cadbury's chocolate, Coca-Cola, chippies, a sari-clad Indian woman holding the hands of her two young children walked up to us. And she greeted me with, "Good morning, ma'am," and introduced herself. And I don't remember her name or the names of her two children who she introduced us to, but I clearly remember her pride when she told me, "They are Anglo-Indian. We speak English, can we talk to you?" And she explained that her children wanted to talk to my girls, which they then did, mostly about where my girls were from and what New Zealand was like and why they were here. And this marked the first time I remember consciously noting the existence of Anglo-Indians, just a couple of days after this very first visit to India. The next day we travelled by the Shatabdi Express to Bangalore. It wasn't until we were back in Madras 6 weeks later, after doing a triangle, that another Anglo-Indian related experience occurred. In our last couple of days in Madras, we spent some time with the Australian woman that we'd met in our hotel earlier. I'd first bumped into one of them in the hotel lobby and mightn't have taken particular notice of her, except for her companions, 3 tiny babies and a wide baby carriage. When I was introduced to the mother of the baby, she told me she was an historian who'd carried out research in Madras. Again, I come back to the story. The story picks up again a little later. It was a couple of years before I heard Anglo-Indians mentioned again. The next time was in New Zealand when I saw that the newly released Australian-produced program, A Calcutta Christmas, was about to be played on the documentary television channel. It was said to feature the pre-Christmas activities of a group of 35 Calcuttan Anglo-Indian rest home residents. From the opening of the documentary to the perhaps overly nostalgic post-colonial closing scenes, I was captivated. I learnt a lot from that documentary, that Anglo-Indians were of mixed descent, culturally more Western than Indian, that their community originated as a result of more than 4 centuries of British rule in India, as it said. And this Brito-Anglo-centric bias in my understanding of who Anglo-Indians were began then and was pretty entrenched for several years. And it wasn't until I spent more time in the south of India that I realised, that I had that bias. So as well as being so fascinated by the Anglo-Indian focused topic of the documentary, I loved the scenes, the smoky orange evening light, the hundreds of yellow ambassador taxis, the footage of the city street scenes. In the meantime, I continued my studies, and as soon as I submitted my MA thesis at the end of the year 2000, also in social anthropology and nothing to do with India, we as a family were off again, this time to the north of India and with company. My MA supervisor and his wife, who had spent a lot of time in India and who had become good friends of ours. We'd been working out itinerary options, and I was especially drawn to the idea of going to Calcutta because I had connections there through Dr. Graham's homes, which I knew very little about. I just knew that I just had the sponsorship relationship with. Once in Calcutta, we stayed in the south of the city, not far, as it happened, from Tollygunge Homes that was featured in that documentary. It was while there that I learnt I'd been successful in the PhD scholarship I'd applied for. The topic was open, but it was granted to me as a scholar rather than on the basis of the topic. From then on, travelling as I was with my now PhD supervisor, we managed to come up with a topic at every stop. The century-old market in Calcutta, the Dhobi Wallahs in Udaipur, the English school-modelled hill station schools in Darjeeling. They all seemed like valuable topics of real anthropological interest that I could become immersed in and really interested in. 7 months after coming back from the North India trip, we went back to India for a 2-week exploratory trip to look at the possibility of research on one of the subjects I'd become especially interested in, Calcutta's 100-year-old New Market or Hog Market. As opening notes, as David said. There's no inner market. It's not just a straight transaction of cash for goods in the markets. There's a lot going on. There's generations of relationships between shop owners and the shoppers. And I was interested in exploring some of these relationships. But it wasn't long before I realised that the research wasn't really feasible for me. As I teach my undergraduates, the anthropologist, as the instrument of data collection, has to be well calibrated for the task. And in order to have access to people and be able to form good enough relationships to be able to get some sense of what matters to them, we needed to be able to communicate. And I had no Indian language except English. Although many of the Newmarket shop owners spoke enough English to make a sale, transactional English was their limit. So how could I conduct this research? So my 2-week investigative trip was running out, and my research topic was losing shape by the day, depressingly. I took solace in spending time with a group of people I'd struck up friendships with through that long-term sponsorship relationship with the Calcutta-based administrative centre for Dr. Graham's homes. The hospitality and support that they offered me was on my mind when, back in New Zealand, still searching for a Newmarket angle, I began to read about various communities who interacted with the market. Over that time, I read Coralie Younger's 1987 book, Anglo-Indians, Neglected Children of the Raj. In it, she proposes a prognosis of decline and eventual demise of the Anglo-Indian community. What I was reading then, and in other articles about the community, was contrary to what I'd experienced in Calcutta. The Anglo-Indians I'd met appeared to be part of a vital, culturally distinct minority, who were still very active in keeping their unique identity alive. So in the end, I centralised Anglo-Indians in my PhD research, focusing particularly on how they were maintaining their identity as a minority community, how they were in practice maintaining their identity. I collected all the published information I could about their community before taking the family back to Calcutta 4 months later for a 2-month fieldwork stint, which turned out to be the first of many more visits to India. My girls, who were in their teenage years then, became quite at home there, and so much so that I could send them to the market to do my own shopping, or down to the street to buy hot leche paratas. They would happily set out for the day together, coming back with stories of their adventures. Mobile phones weren't around as they are today, so I couldn't keep track of them, but they were quite safe and quite happy. They would come back and tell me about a dog show they'd been to in the Maidan, for example, and had all sorts of other adventures. But coming back to Madras again, at the tail end of that first trip, where I said I'd had a significant Anglo-Indian encounter, but hadn't explained quite how. I hadn't recognised it as such, and there's no way I would have except for a chance remark from another Anglo-Indian research some years later. By then I was well into my PhD research and had arranged to meet an Anglo-Indian academic who lived in Melbourne, Glenn de Cruz. And we'd met to discuss some of my findings, to just talk about things Anglo-Indian. We also chatted about various other Anglo-Indian researchers. Glenn mentioned the details of one woman who had published on the community, which was so unique that I realised that the woman we'd met in the hotel in Madras was Coralie Younger, the author of the first scholarly work I ever read on Anglo-Indians. By the time I made this connection, sadly, she had died of cancer that she was battling when I had met her. So with the recognition of this serendipitous occurrence, I realised the significance of others as well. The long-term sponsorship of Anglo-Indian students at Dr. Graham's homes, meeting Anglo-Indians within the first days of the first trip to India, watching the Anglo-Indian film of Tollygunge Homes so soon after it was released, even being notified of the scholarship success while I was in Calcutta, just down the road from the homes. I now fail to be surprised at the way Anglo-Indians have become central to my research, as well as to other areas of my life. And I failed to be surprised at the serendipity that events that still happen, things just often just fall into place, or I just happen to meet a person that I had just heard about or read about. I've come to regard the serendipity throughout my research as something of a method or a tool, and I'm not the only one to do this. The Collins Dictionary defines serendipity as, I quote, the faculty of making happy and unexpected discoveries by accident, unquote. Another describes it as serendipity as the fortune of the prepared mind. That's the title of Ian Morley and Mark Duron's 2010 book, which explores the place of serendipity in ethnographic practice. They elaborate on the need to be prepared in order to recognise it as serendipitous. According to Alf Hernes, who I first heard talking about serendipity as I was writing up my PhD thesis and had gone to a conference at Durham University. I heard him talking about it in 2003. And he talks about, and I quote, slow research, he says that slow research embraces the power of serendipity, allowing the unexpected to reconfigure the research itself, unquote. So working with Anglo-Indians has been easy on many levels, easy and enjoyable, often because of your key characteristics: speaking English, being Christians, mostly Catholic, it's something I share with the community, and generally being very Western in outlook and worldview. I also enjoy the ways of socialising, to the point that I used to feel a bit guilty at times about my field work involving attending house parties, going to dances, and eating very well. The relative gender equality within the community is also a factor that makes it easy to work with the group. I've been able to move between men and women, interviewing both quite comfortably. And while I've probably made very close friends with Anglo-Indian women, I also count men among my friends. One of these has, some years ago now, become my husband, Keith Butler. On that topic, while our English language is shared, I've had to learn a few new phrases or meanings. For example, being friendly is a term that carries more significance here than in New Zealand, where it does just mean being a friend. But being friendly is different again. So my positionality has changed over the course of the years of my research, from being a true, though interested outsider, to now being married to the community. As I wrote this, I wondered, does this make Anglo-Indians my community-in-law? I'll take that. So while that was the start, which looking back at it and distilled into 15 minutes seems, and really was, wonderfully inevitable, I've also had challenging research times. It's not always been easy negotiating some of the politics, with a disappointing outcome a few years ago around a survey I was involved in, for example. And that involved being seen by certain parties with enough power to have some influence as, I quote, a foreign agent wanting to sell stories of poverty, which I felt a bit sad about, but, that was what happened. I'm going to continue with storytelling to tell of another challenging episode. Obviously, for ethical and reasons of courtesy, I've been careful about personal details of the story. I fast forward now to 2014, just after my book, Christmas in Calcutta, was published. I was in South India for a couple of weeks to meet, spend time with, and interview Anglo-Indians there as part of a project to explore Anglo-Indian life in areas other than Calcutta, that I'd spent so much time. I'd been told more than once, and by different people in different parts of the world, that I had a very Calcutta-centric view of Anglo-Indians. I think that book reflects that, actually. So I was in South India, and I was carrying a copy of the book, at least partly to demonstrate to those I met that I had some clues about the community, at least the Calcutta community. And it also showed that I did something with the research data I was asking to collect. And I hoped it would fast-track the building of rapport and trust. I was particularly interested in the Anglo-Indians of Portuguese descent. In my first few days of fieldwork, I'd been invited to participate in a Catholic local feast day procession and also attend a rosary meeting the day after. The intensely and devoutly practicing Catholic nature of the community there felt familiar, being similar to what I'd encountered with Anglo-Indians in other parts of India, mainly Calcutta. As a co-religious, as a Catholic, I expected that I could take part in these events quite comfortably and usefully in terms of the field work I was primarily there for. So after participating in what turned out to be a bafflingly unfamiliar procession, followed by attendance at the home-based rosary, I was able to recruit a number of interviewees. One was a strikingly good-looking, well-groomed woman dressed in fashionably, expensively cut Western clothes, who had the level of sophistication I'd encountered particularly in wealthy Anglo-Indians living abroad. I looked forward to an interview over lunch a couple of days later. At her request, I'd left a copy of my book with her before the interview. I arrived at her home with a bottle of New Zealand wine, not something I'd usually take to an Anglo-Indian family home for lunch, but I was coming to the end of my time in India and I'd brought it to give away. And I thought she would probably appreciate it. And her home certainly reflected style, taste, and sophistication. She told me of her weekly trips to a top-end local hotel where she dined after her session at the beauty salon. She suggested we make a trip there together. I enjoyed with anticipation the sense of being pampered, especially since this was work. All was going well, or so it seemed. We decided to get the interview over before lunch. We topped up our G&Ts, which she'd poured as soon as I walked in the door, and sat down on her comfortable sofa. I turned the recorder on, intending to begin by asking about her background. Instead, she asked the first question, which was, I wonder, why did you continue the stereotyping of our community by writing your book in the way you did? I was dumbfounded. She said she hadn't read it all, but felt she'd read enough to see what I had done. According to her, I had highlighted the plight of Anglo-Indians and poverty in Calcutta when they no longer lived like that. The book felt like something from the 18th century, she said. You can probably imagine how I felt. I had felt comfortable with her, felt accepted, even liked, but now I felt attacked, and in my view, completely unfairly. Somehow I had to quickly adjust my attitude and performance of the impression management type that all researchers must practice to some extent, and also defend myself and my work diplomatically, and defend, I felt, the Anglo-Indians of Calcutta, as well as wanting to convince her that my work highlighted, what my work actually did was highlight the diversity in the community. It was important to me that she understood that poverty does still exist in the community. What finally seemed convincing to her was the very existence of an Anglo-Indian social service organisation, or several organisations. After a tense discussion, she said very good-naturedly that she must go to Calcutta sometime and see for herself. She then invited me to ask my questions, and we then picked up the interview again. So I've related the second story, which is one of several I could have selected, in order to highlight several issues of doing fieldwork, such as not being able to predict reactions to ourselves or to our work. When we're dealing with people and it's an interpersonal relationship that we're engaged in, we can't control the situation. And in needing, it also highlights the need to be responsive to situations and be able to adjust quite quickly as they arise, particularly adapting ourselves emotionally to a change in circumstances. So this was certainly an example of not being able to control the way our work is read as well. One of the reasons I decided to write stories is to avoid homogenising Anglo-Indian lives, to portray distinct lives as that, unique. This is particularly important for a community which does seem to have had more than its fair share of negative stereotyping. But it was still those stories that were focused on by my reader. in this case, and she voiced her very real frustration about that as being part of that community that I had depicted. She felt in this way. As a researcher with an ongoing relationship with the community, I really needed to control my instinct to be defensive and to take very seriously what she was saying and discuss it with her. I'm going to finish here with thanks for staying with me as I journeyed through some important moments in my research relationship with the community. I will be here, I have a little bit of time now, and I'm also here over the next 2 days, obviously, free to answer questions, and we will talk more about research and the experience of research over the next couple of days. So thank you.